Hello, everyone. This is May, somehow, 3rd, 2020. And welcome to today's conclave of the Gray Area Book Club covering the 50th anniversary of Gene Youngblood's Expanded Cinema. And today we're covering section 3 on Towards Cosmic Consciousness. And we're welcoming back Gene. Hi, Gene.
Hello, everybody.
And also welcome Erik Davis, who is a writer, scholar, journalist, and public speaker whose writings have ranged from rock criticism to cultural analysis to creative explorations of esoteric mysticism, which we'll be delving into today. His book, 1998 book, Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, explores our fascination with technology, intersecting with religious imagination. And his newest book, High Weirdness, Drug, Esoterica, and Visionary Experiences in the 70s is an exploration of the emergence of a new psychedelic spirituality in the work of Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson. Thanks for joining us, Erik.
Hey, I'm just really happy to be here and great to spend some time with you, Gene. I just got to say a little bit like Expanded Cinema was really important to me when I was doing my research for Technosis, because in the vast literature on the 60s, there really aren't that many texts that fully embrace the cybernetic paradigm as part of the new consciousness explosion, and doing so in a way that's very specific technologically or in terms of media, not just a general term like a McLuhan kind of thing. You have those big ideas, but you also really get down into the nitty gritty. And particularly in this chapter, you know, where you get these wonderful juxtapositions of the most expansive kind of visionary potentials that were being articulated at that time and continue to be part of our worldview, and then married with these really nice technical discussions of light tables and photographic cinema, and it's a wonderful conjunction that to my mind really says something specific about the kind of newer currents of consciousness exploration, which is that there's a technical or scientific aspect to them that is we don't find in the past, and that gets motivated and concretized in these particular works of cinema that you're looking at in the technology behind the mystical Stargate sequence at the end of 2001, which you talk about in this chapter, as well as the cinema of Jordan Belson, was just one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. And we'll have a treat later on where we decided to show one of the films that you discuss in the section, Samadhi, which is 5 minutes long. We can see that a little bit later. But anyway, I just want to introduce how important this work is to me. And I'm just kind of curious, I know it's a sort of a general question, but when you look back, particularly at this chapter and the enthusiasm, the sense of expansive possibilities, the sense of a change in the air, how do you see that from this long perspective? Just to throw in one little bit, on the one hand, I can see all the things that have held us back from some of those realizations. And yet in a weird way, the things you're talking about are more pertinent now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. There's another crux we're at. So I kind of see it as this interesting mix, but I'd love to hear how you reflect on these ideas today.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for what you just said. I really appreciate it. In the introduction, I wrote this new introduction, and somewhere in there it says, in nearly 400 lectures around the world in the ensuing years, meaning after Expanded Cinema came out, I never once in 400 lectures spoke about Expanded Cinema as such. It was always, by that time, I had gotten totally obsessed with what I continue to be this very day, radical politics and what that could mean in our time. And it was so I would be invited to lecture, and I would launch on this political screed or whatever you want to call it. And people seem to like it. And this is by way of saying that I'm I'm very curious to hear your take on the world today because, I mean, this subject in the world today, because I'm totally off touch with it. My brain has been in another universe for decades. And it actually kind of surprised me when I realized through your work that these ideas are still alive and interest in them. So I'm really eager to how you make the connection between half a century ago and now. It's very fascinating to me. I'm gonna learn a lot here.
Well, no, I'm really, that's a wonderful kind of way of framing it, because anytime I talk about this stuff, particularly now, but it's always been the case, is that even though I'm fascinated with expanded consciousness and spiritual practices and psychedelics and the return of magic and all those kinds of things, I always very much see them as working in a very real, material, historical, political world. And it's that tension between them that often really intrigues me. So it doesn't actually surprise me that if those politics are only kind of implied in the kind of transformative energy that we can still pick up in expanded cinema, that it took such a concrete form later. And I think one of the outstanding questions we have now, and it's in some ways it's still a very kind of West Coast question, is that as we move into the altered states of consciousness with more and more technology, more and more control. I mean, the way in which, like what we call today, consciousness hacking, where people who are interested in new technologies, interested in brain devices, interested in transcendental states of consciousness, and in some of them in a quite idealistic and even utopian way, are seeing, looking at the forward, the horizon of disaster that we're all, confronting, and saying, look, it might be that the only way we're going to kind of get through this is to have some way of like changing people's consciousness so that they're able to overcome some of their fear or their ego or whatever it is, which is a very 60s idea that we see replayed again. And one of the outstanding questions I have now is what the politics of that is, and if it can be saved politically, or if it's actually just another kind of neoliberal rabbit holing inside of the self-obsessed narcissism of late consumer capitalism. And it's in tension. It's both and. It's a kind of dynamic. And so when I say about how relevant some of this stuff seems to me, I'm really kind of thinking of that example where it's that Buddhism, mindfulness meditation, psychedelics, the idea that expanded consciousness can be healing and even useful, even in a kind of narcissistic way. These are all now absolutely part of popular culture in a way they weren't even 10 years ago. So there's a return of some of these themes into a more general discussion, partly because there's a desperation about what else is going, where else are we going to get medicines, how else are we going to heal all these traumatized people? So part of it is because of the desperation of the situation. And part of it is that the technology is getting better, that we are actually starting to be able to manipulate energies in the brain and recognize that they have some similarities with psychedelics. At the same time, there's this tremendous popular interest in psychedelics. And what's come out of that relates to expanded cinema is that there's an uptick in visual media that is more and more explicitly attempting to not only reflect psychedelic experience, but kind of generate or stage it. In some sense, that's been the case for a long time. You can look at the history of special effects, look at the history of animation from the 70s and 80s and 90s forward, and you can find these tendrils of psychedelic inspiration, obviously, through the whole thing. But now there's not only more attention on it, but also the sense that, hey, we may be able to actually produce these kinds of states without the drugs, maybe with the right, brain mechanism coupled with the right kind of, immersive environment, or, any number of different kinds of technologies. There's this sense of the possibility of actually being able to generate or allow people more easily into these states, sometimes without psychedelics, sometimes with them. So in some ways, this kind of consciousness expansion is back in a big way.
I'm
And,
thrilled to hear that.
you know, and I have two questions about it. One is the political one. How does this get coupled with the political necessities of the time and not become another, interning of a kind of narcissism, of a sort of self expansion without that larger framework? And then the other one, which I think is where I'd like to start, and to hear more about how you see it, and also what was motivating you in the 60s, is that now it's not very cosmic. We don't really talk about cosmic anymore. We don't really think about space that way. There's a minority of people who are super into like imagining living on Mars or whatever, but it's very practical and technical now. Space is now, the realm of Elon Musk. Like Elon Musk is a visionary, not Arthur C. Clarke. Space is not a place of transformation. It's the next stage of capital in a lot of ways. And there's one part I'd like to read, and then we can talk about it, I hope, where you ask, you get to interview Arthur C. Clarke, which is great, a wonderful treat, no doubt. And you're talking about 2001, you're saying, yeah, it's kind of realistic, but look, you have all these corporations in there. You have Pan Am, which is no longer a corporation, but, Pan Am and these other corporations. That's not how we're going to go into space with these corporate. The only way to get into space will have to be in this new consciousness, this new political organization. And of course, that's probably not the case. We're probably going to go into space, probably going to have, robots mining asteroids and sending them down on private space, units, and, the privatization of space is happening. The lack of international, protocols around space is going to be very gnarly in just 5, 10, 15 years as space weapons get better. So it's like, what happened? What happened, Gene? It's the classic younger person question to the boomer generation. What? No, there was so much it was going to happen. What happened? So,
good question. Before I respond to that, if I can, I want to give a definition of utopian or utopia, which I've done in previous book club meetings here. Utopia is not a place or a thing or a situation or a condition. It's one thing only, it's a desire. That comes from Frederick Jameson, one of my heroes, intellectual heroes. And if you think about it, it can only ever be that. It never was anything other than that. A desire. And a desire for what? Release from hierarchy. You can't call anything utopian and have it still be in a hierarchical world where there are dominators and the underclass, That's it, period, zero. So you can apply that concept, the desire for release from hierarchy, to any aspect of human life. Right now, we're talking about that aspect we're calling reality. I have another language that I use with that, which I get from Michel Foucault, the technologies of the self. He was talking about something else. He wasn't talking about drugs, talking about psychology and other things like that. But man, that phrase, technologies of the self, hit me like an atom bomb when I first found it. So if you combine those two concepts, that utopia is a desire for release from hierarchy, and the technology of the self, meaning your psyche, your imagination, your imaginarium, as some people say. To me, that's a potent combination there. You asked what happened to cosmic consciousness and all that. Well, first of all, I think it's probably obvious. I was really thinking about those movies, about Jordan Belson. And I was only trying to say in my admittedly, I was very young, I was a kid. I was just trying to say that we have not seen in cinema these images, these attitudes towards the images, these desires for those kinds of images to mean something larger than themselves. And that simply was not happening in commodity cinema at all, except for really dumb sci-fi movies. And I hesitate to even compare the two. So that's, I was very narrow there. I was just talking about these guys making these movies, cosmic. Otherwise, I would have probably never used the word at all. They used it.
Yeah.
Belson used it. They informed me about how to talk about it. Let's remember, though, you mentioned the 60s. We were open to anything that wasn't America, right? American culture, open to anything, because man, things were looking horrible, Vietnam, all that stuff. And there's a phrase also, and I think in social psychology, something called mass individuation. I believe there's some concept like that, where let's say a generation, let's call mass a generation at the moment, to individuate themselves apart, distinct themselves apart from the background, the history, the big scene, and identify themselves differently. And that's what we were doing on a pretty significant scale. That's how I see the 60s, part of it. And we were doing through everything, through all the arts, all the music, all the drugs, anything we could get our hands on to get away from this hierarchy of definitions of what's real and what's not, what's important and what's not, what's good and bad, right and wrong. All of that was under question. I believe that that's happening again today, and you can probably tell me more than I know about that. But if it isn't happening today, we're in serious trouble. So I'd like to hear more about that from you.
Yeah. The trouble is nigh. I'm kind of tempted to stop a moment and actually talk about Belson a little bit, because he's such a fascinating character, and particularly because I'm so interested in California and Bay Area stuff. Just to sort of bring him forward a little bit. Probably some people haven't seen him. We're having a little discussion about whether we actually should screen this film now because of rights and things. And it was my last minute idea, because I know that I had to wait for a long time to see his film, certainly on actual film, which happened very rarely. And there is a DVD. There are some things out there, so people may have already have already seen them. But in any case, we'll work that out. But just to talk a little bit more about what made Jordan Belson so special, and one place to launch into it is that on one level you could say, oh, these were abstract films, people might say, because what we see are non-narrative images, lines, colors, beautiful waves, all these optical effects that they very rarely, sometimes you can tell it's an ocean, there's some spaceship stuff, some found footage, but overall it's this kind of language of non-narrative, non-figurative impressions, patterns, clusters, etc. And yet you make the strong argument, and I think it's a really deep point, that these are actually concrete films. And it's that tension between the way that we use abstraction as a kind of artistic term and the concreteness of these films, their materiality and their relationship to material production, that I think is part of where the magic is. So maybe that's one way into talking about his films.
Yeah.
That would be good to hear about.
I have an anecdote. And by the way, I like what you just said. Yes, they're concrete. And also it made me think a little more about this idea of technology of the self. All culture, any culture, anywhere, and every aspect of it is a technology of the self. We create ourselves within whatever you want to call the culture, whatever the culture you live in. We use it to make us who we are. You can't not do that. Okay, so any movie, Hollywood movie, you name it, from the entire spectrum of human consciousness as embodied in culture, let's say, is a technology of the self. I like to talk about it that way. I have an anecdote about Jordan Belson. I saw his films, and as I guess we're about to see, they're incredible, very, very beautiful. Nothing like them had been seen before. And let me make a point there. Nothing like them had been seen before. That is universally true when if you ask yourself, where do those things come from? Those things that we had not seen before. they never come from professionals. Never. They come from amateurs. People are doing it for love. Therefore, they're not constrained by anything except their desire, their utopian desire, right? To release themselves from the hierarchy of imagination. Culture is an imaginarium and is hierarchical. So anyway, I saw those films that were shown in Los Angeles at the time, in the 1960s when I was writing for the Free Press. There were 3 so-called underground cinema venues. 3. There are probably 0 now, but they're all online and better. But anyway, so I would go to this thing. They were brand new. Nothing like this ever existed before. Underground cinema, what's that? You go see it. And so that's how I saw him, saw Belson, blew me away, as it does most people. They're so gorgeous. And so I just call him up, man, can I come up and interview you? Yes, of course. So I come up there, and here's what happened. He had his apartment was on the 2nd floor of not his apartment, his studio was on the 2nd floor of one of those old San Francisco wood, beautiful old places. And so knock on the door opens very slowly. Here's this guy, very kind of handsome, tall guy in black, all dressed in black. He says, come right this way. We go up these stairs. Another door opens into this room that's entirely flat black. And then he says, you sit here. And he had a chair bolted to the floor in one particular spot. So you sit there. Then he turned out the lights and nothing. Just silence. And I'm waiting for the film to come on. And I'm waiting. And I'm waiting. And then all of a sudden, boom, that beam comes over my head to the screen. And there's this awesome thing called Samadhi or momentum, or he showed me all of them. Well, that's a very human thing to do. It's not business, The guy felt that way about his art, and he wanted me to understand. He wanted me to see him seeing himself as that kind of person. I basically grew up in Hollywood. My wife at the time went to school at MGM. So I was, I was on TV there. This was a world so far beyond what most of us knew that it just completely blew me away. So that's a little anecdote, but to me that's very important. How this guy saw himself, and then here was these images that I never saw before, which could only come out of the little bowls of glass and the little turning turntables and all this stuff that he made for himself, and conjured this magic out of these things. And I just fell in love with this this way of being in the world. That's all I can say. I think you would agree that when you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about a way of being in the world.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things that really that you talk about in your chapter that this is where I really learned about it is just how far Belson went into his own experience, up to especially the film Samadhi, which I think came out in 67, 68, that he really just shut down his life and entered into deep yoga practice. And that's what really kind of intrigued me from the perspective of today, is that today there's a lot of yoga, there's a lot of meditation, there's a lot of people who are, developing these tools and these experiences. But the question for me as like a cultural historian is always like, okay, but what's the frame? What's the intent? Where is this going? What is it serving? And in a lot of cases, unfortunately, it's serving some version of capitalism is normal, as that commodity world that you're contrasting to this beautiful private but also universal kind of or cosmic work that he was doing.
Can I insert one thought here?
Absolutely.
A quote from Norman Mailer, which you probably heard 1,000 times. A turned on square is just a turned on square.
Yes, I like that. And then, so that one of the things that I love about Belson's story is that on the one hand, he definitely was what we would call now a consciousness hacker, in the sense that he was doing these practices. He wanted to see where it would take him, what kinds of experiences he would have in his own energetic system, his own internal visual system. If people are long-term meditators, they'll know that you can start to see lights and patterns and fluctuations, dynamics that are not dissimilar from a Belson film. And obviously this is part of psychedelic experience, which he was also very familiar with peyote and LSD. And, he took these things very consciously and probably quite intensely, as a lot of people did in those days who were pushing the envelope. So he's having these experiences, but then it's like the experiences are a site or an inspiration or almost a demand to go into this gear, to build these physical material objects and processes that would enable a kind of mirroring of the photographic plate or whatever, the screen, the image, the shot with his own experiences. And to me, that's just such a marvelous way of kind of exploring the aesthetic side of these experiences. And by aesthetic, I don't want to suggest, mere aesthetics like prettiness, or it's just the art part of existence, like aesthetics is off here and everything else is, politics and work. I mean aesthetics as the feeling of existence, the feeling of things. And that I think a lot of things are opened up by tuning into the feeling of things, including political stuff, that we miss if we just put aesthetics off to the side. So when I say there's an aesthetic dimension to his appreciation of altered states or higher states or meditative states, I mean that he saw them as forms of feeling as well as whatever, states of samadhi or things that you could identify in some old book somewhere. And that is part of what you get to pick up in his films. So Barry, where are we on what are we going to show? Are we going to try this or not? I'm happy to keep talking. So I realized that I did this late. That was my vision last night. I've been.
Go ahead.
With just the way that we had set it up?
I think so.
Okay, sorry.
Apologies necessary.
Okay, so since we've been talking about it, let's watch Samadhi, and you can always put in the chat if there's a problem or anything, and then when we get back, we'll get to some of the questions. So here we go, and let me make sure. Yep, that's all optimized. So it's about 5 minutes long. Gene, if you have any comments, go ahead. I mean, it's a good thing. It's a good film to trip out on, but if you see stuff or want to explain anything or any comments that come back, please feel free.
Okay.
right, folks, we're going to have to cut it off there. I wanted to acknowledge that this is from the DVD from the Center for Visual Music, and we appreciate the showing that little bit of fair use there. And so,
yeah, that lady is Cindy Kiefer,
yeah.
and she's a cool lady. Thank you, Cindy.
So now we have, let's see, we have a couple of questions here. We got one posted. Let's go into there. What I see in Gene's book in 1970 was a focus on exploration of consciousness through art making, not just art consumption. This was focused on new art makers like Belson or Michael Snow. Today, we have the internet as popular medium for experimentation and interaction. There's a current popularization and personal practice with Buddhism and mindfulness that duplicates and supports a similar aesthetic. What do you think? Where do you think this could go? So what do you see in terms of our contemporary media environment, Gene, and how some of these older, if you want to think about them that way, inspirations can, have play out in our current technological environment?
Good question. Let me first say, I guess I've said it here many times. When you say our current media environment, number one, I have not used, and I'm using that word used instead of watched, I have not used state media, and everyone else would say corporate media. I have not used state media for 35 years. That means I haven't seen most things that y'all have seen. I've never seen Fox News. I have no idea what it is. I never want to know. So number one, that's important to grasp. Number two, and I don't do internet stuff. I don't have a smartphone. I retreated. I have a friend, very dear friend, and he's the one that I interviewed Clark in the book, Ted Zatlin. He wants, and he's my close friend for this reason. This is one of the reasons. He said, Gene, one day he said, there's two modes of life. Oh, Ted, what is that? Retreat and deep retreat, he said. Now, I'm a little different. I love life and I'm not about to retreat from it, but I surely understood what the man was saying. There's a need in us for deep retreat from this thing out there called modern civilization. And now I'm rolling on, I forget what the...
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I know what it is. I know what I want to say. My current work, kind of the culmination of my lifelong interest in political stuff, is called Secession from the Broadcast, Leave the Culture Without Leaving the Country. So I want to, without explaining that more than I ever have here, I just hope you can kind of abstractly grasp that if all of us, all is in quotes, of course, left the culture, it would come down immediately, without violence, without protest. You're just not there. I don't think that's going to happen because everybody's so locked into it. Their identity is inseparable from it, and it'd be like committing suicide. That's tragic. I see that as tragedy. But in any case, part of this thing, secession of the broadcast, leave the culture, is the idea, going back to expanded cinema, when I said the first page there, something about taking the things out of our mind and putting in front of our eyes. We can do that today to an extent that was unimaginable back then, of course. And the technologies, the three things to me are the internet, artificial intelligence, and reality technologies. You can leave the culture without leaving the country unimaginably at scale that way. These new technologies of the self are coming. And it's just imperative to me that as many people as possible see them that way as a means of leaving. But you can't leave if you can't arrive somewhere else. You got to have a destination. You have to have something that's opposite to that which you want to leave. And so to me, the most powerful political action done today is creating these worlds that are the destination of those who want to exit, leave, goodbye, and use them as meditations, whatever you want to call it, to consciously, deliberately transform yourself. If that sounds like hippie stuff, you're not thinking along the lines that I'm thinking. To me, this is as serious politics as you can possibly get. The basis of social control is to control people's identity, of their own self-identification. There's nothing more powerful than that. If you can get away from that, if there's an avenue out of that, I would argue that with any rabid revolutionary any day of the week.
Well, these are really stimulating ideas for me because, one of the things that I've been sort of tracking is how, as psychedelics and Buddhism and these kind of alternative worlds, as virtual reality becomes more, all these things that have an aspect of them of this otherness and this potential escape velocity that you're talking about, that there's sort of two other things that are happening. One is that people who are politically invested see that escape velocity as mere escapism, sometimes for good reason, but they don't recognize what you're talking about, which is that technologies of the self, internal and external, have the capacity to bring us individually and even collectively to some degree into such a different set of identifications that we're actually pulling away from the consensus trance. So that's an important point.
Hey, I like that phrase.
Yeah.
Consensus trance.
The other side of it is also, and this is the disappointing side of the story, is watching the way that the framing of these powerful technologies has enabled them to maintain business as usual for a lot of people. That's the turned on straight is still straight kind of kind of situation, and that's also very, very available. And then that becomes another reason for people to not kind of recognize the still radical potential of these kinds of other worlds.
Yeah, two comments.
Comments. Please.
Right, and I immediately forget them. I am losing my memory. The way I kind of like to use the language, I try to discipline myself never to attribute to technology what humans are doing. So it's really hard to discipline yourself not to say things like, oh, these technologies are going to do X, Y, Z. Technologies do nothing. Zero. Humans do everything. That's number one. Right, and the second one, framing. I know that word in the context in which it's used. I always try to use context. Control of context is everything. A thing is where it is. You move it from this context to another one, it's something different. This is obvious to us all the time. Look at the political craziness that's going on. There's something called the Kuleshov effect, which I'd like to take about 2 minutes here. Russia, back in the day when Eisenstein was doing montage and all that, this guy named Lev Kuleshov did this experiment. He showed, let's say, and I'm not going to explain this quite well. He showed a picture of somebody smiling. Then he showed some other picture that next to them, which would, quote, explain why they're smiling. Then he showed an exactly opposite kind of picture. Let's say the first one was really soft, fuzzy, and warm and wonderful, and the second one was horrific. But you still got that person smiling. That makes them a total pervert, crazy person. Context is absolutely everything. Reality depends on context. If you can leave the dominant context and put yourself in another one, this is what I'm trying to say. We can do this today. The technology is not going to do it. We can do it. If we are discouraged from doing that because it's us, because we've internalized it so much that we just, like, we don't have an identity if we would leave it. Hey, too bad. That's what faces us. That's You could call that bad news. I don't think it's bad news. The good news is we can do it for the first time in human history at scale.
Well, so how do you see technology or art or media playing a role in that movement at scale, away from the dominant connection? Since on some level, everything's internetworked so tightly that that's one of the features of the moment, is that if you have a little subculture that you develop and you're doing stuff offline and you're doing your own little world, it will quickly be found, discovered. And because it's novel, will be written about, commented on, brought into the larger network of signals that is part of this consensus, part of the mechanism that sustains consensus. So from that dropout point of view, what do you see the role as people who are engaged with technology or engaged with media, engaged with making art objects? How do they help support that process rather than just make some more novelty that gets absorbed once again into the business as usual?
Right. What I mean by scale, by at scale.
Sure.
The internet connects us all. Big cliche. Attached to the internet is us, our brains, our imaginations. Also attached to the internet is coming artificial intelligence, reality technologies, that stuff. The internet is global. That means all that stuff is global. So that's the scale I'm talking about. If a significant number of people were doing with those technologies right now, the internet, AI, and reality technologies around the world, and they were doing what I'm talking about, they're consciously leaving the culture. Hey, I don't care if CBS runs it, we're leaving, you know? You're either leaving or you're not. And when you start talking about co-optation and all that, well, that's a very interesting thought. Can global efforts to transform ourselves be co-opted? I'm not saying they can't, but I find that hard to, you know, if I'm saying to those who would co-opt me, hey, I'm leaving you, fuck you, how are they going to co-opt me?
Yeah, that reminds me of something I've talked to people who are like meditation teachers, and sometimes they work for companies. You know, companies decide, oh, you know, we hear that mindfulness is good for people's, you know, dealing with stress and, you know, productivity and stuff. So they're, you know, being capitalist about it, but they want their, you know, employees to be happy. And so these meditation teachers come in and they teach and, you know, just sort of you know, kind of initial stuff. And I asked them, like, well, do people start really like questioning their underlying values and what they're doing there through their meditation that they picked up as part of a job training? And he goes, oh yeah. And so it's sort of difficult for them because they'll get somebody who's like, gee, that meditation, I'm starting to wonder what I'm even doing here. Like, why do I keep coming to work? What's the point? And you're like, and the guy's like, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do with this. So I love the idea that there is kind of a time bomb or something that can't be avoided in these new technologies of the self, that from the outside, they look like just another way to have fun or expand your personal power or something like that. But once you get in them, there's like a logic or a demand that you can't avoid, and that those things will help produce this kind of shift. It's a bit of a you know, it's an optimistic scenario, but I think it's one that's definitely worth playing with. God damn. Let me see if I got another question. Let's actually, we had a couple questions here. All right. Your conversation about the shifting place of the cosmic makes me wonder about the shifting place of panpsychism as well. So I read the chapter title, Cosmic Consciousness, as referring less to literal outer space than to engaging our minds into a communal mind, an idea that your book connects to Teilhard de Chardin and associates with new media. Where is this constellation of panpsychism, cosmicism, and technophilia? Where is it taking us? Is it actually creating a kind of collective idea of mind, the way that de Chardin? Is that is that step en masse that you're talking about something that happens in some sort of collective formation, or are we still mostly talking about individual minds there?
Again, we're still using what is it going to do to us? I just reject that kind of language. What are we going to do with these available technologies, period? You're going to play games with them. You're going to be a consumer. It's your choice, you know? And the thing is, you have to realize you have a choice. That's number one. And number two, even more important, you have to have the desire to leave. Most people don't. And I'm just saying that's tragic, because that's the thing that can bring this thing down in the next 5 seconds if we left en masse. I don't know how to say this more. To me, it's just so obvious. I can't. And it gives my life total joy to realize that we've come to this point. And I don't care if we blow it. We at least came to this point. Here we are. We could do it.
Fascinating. I'm curious, when you said you dropped out, or I don't know exactly the right word, but sort of stepped away from state media / corporate media at some point decades ago. Was there a part of you that was questioning that, in the sense that, well, that's what, you know, some of us should do, but you know, you're a writer, you're involved in tracking cinema, you're tracking things that are going out in the culture, like how you, I don't know, did you have political qualms about that? Or was it just very clear to you that the way forward for you, and hopefully for modeling for the rest of us, is to step away from a lot of things that I think us today, we feel like we can't really step away from, even if we have those desires, like I have those desires, but I feel so embedded in, you know, communication networks as they are, to communicate to people, to teach, to do my work, that it's really hard for me to imagine making that kind of step away. So I'm really curious how that worked for you.
Okay, I'll do two ways. First, answer your first part. Yeah, you know, I'm a discerning person, artistically oriented, but that does you no good if you don't have some kind of environment that validates it, helps you cultivate it. Okay, so number one, kind of that kind of person. Number two, as a teacher, I wanted to teach a thing called mass media and society. So I started reading all these books that analyze, you know, I guess the general heading would be Mass Media and the Crisis of Democracy. Noam Chomsky, and several meetings ago, I held up all those books. Remember, I held up all those books? Michael Parenti, all of them. So I was already, you know, reading and teaching and learning the critique. Why would you want to critique the broadcast? Oh, wow, really? Is that why they're doing that to us? So you learn these things, you know? I mean, they're not like huge secrets. So that was that. Then let me just give you an example of my life today, which has been my life for quite a long time. In, I believe it was 1995, when Free Speech TV came on, started up. I guess you all know what Free Speech TV is, right? And I said, what? What is that? It's impossible for TV to be free. So I tune in, and here's this person, Amy Goodman, here are these people. And it was indeed radically opposite to what I call the broadcast dominant culture. I was teaching at the College of Santa Fe here, which no longer exists. I called up Free Speech TV. I said, send somebody down here to lecture and tell us what you're doing. They must have been on the air for like 2 weeks when I did that. This is 1995. Guy came, gave a great presentation about what they were all about. And then, and everybody loved it. Thank you, goodbye, all that. And I assume some of my students started watching that, certainly not all, because again, people, that's their identity. The broadcast is their identity. Okay, so then of course I started looking for everything like that. The internet was coming up. This is 95, this is 95 internet, remember. But anywhere I was looking constantly for something that you could call serious alternative view on life. And I just never stopped doing it. And today, it's equally important what I'm not knowing and what I am knowing. are equally important. And I try as much as possible to use that thing as a technology of the self. This may sound goofy to you, but one of the things I do, if I want to watch, quote, state media, I will only watch Al Jazeera, any foreign media, being fully aware that they are state media just like ours, but they're not ours. So I can leave the culture, at least in that little tiny sense. Then sometimes I try to find channels that aren't even in English, and I don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I just want to fill my house with this thing that's alien, that I don't know what they're talking about. I know that's, it may sound crazy. Think about it a little while, please.
No, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like very practical dimensions of your own technology of the self in terms of inviting alterity, otherness into the world building that goes along with media consumption, any kind of media consumption.
Yeah, and goes along with leaving. Now, I wish I didn't have to do these crazy things that I'm talking to you about. I wish I could just flat out leave and not have to have channels on that I don't understand. And this is what I call the build. I use that capital T, capital B, the build. I see that as the era, literally the era. You know what an era is? It's like geological era. It's like the machine age. We're in an era, which I am now calling the build. We are either going to build this alternative world that we can live in 24/7, secede from the broadcast, or we are not. It's one way or the other. You might say, oh, well, they're not going to permit it. I look forward to that, because it would be flat out, blatant admission. We are totalitarianism. We are totalitarian, and you may not leave. I'm going to push it one way or the other.
As you have detached yourself from the state corporate story in this process, you talked about you can't just do it willy-nilly. You need to have alternative contexts, other forms of identification. Were there particular sources, groups, ideas, practices in your life that enabled you to achieve that kind of stability, such that you're able to detach from the mainstream story, or in ways that might help people who are wrestling with these issues now?
That's a hard question. That's a good question, and therefore hard. I guess I was fortunate in being kind of an outsider, feeling alienated after a certain point in my young life. I couldn't articulate it. Writing expanded cinema was a kind of an attempt to articulate it for myself, to help me understand what it was that I wanted out of life. And I got a little closer, I can only say that from reading true literature, true art, exposing myself to really art and the spiritual thing that art really is at bottom, is spirituality. The broadcast, as I call it, dominant culture, just seemed more and more and more alien to me. The way to leave is to go somewhere else and then look back and say, whoa, what was that? I feel so nourished now. So I don't know if you're asking, you said something like, was there some movement or some institution or some social practice? No, there was just the awareness that there was something other than commodities in life. And there was a way to live that wasn't the hustle. And the more I thought of it as the hustle, the more depressed I got, because you're seeing truth. You're seeing reality as true, what it really is, all out there in the hustle, internalizing the hustle. I am the hustle. This will be me forever. Well, it's not nourishing my heart. And I don't know, that's all I can say is it wasn't even work for me, Suddenly this door opened, I would charge out at any second. I'm so glad I did.
No, I'm really moved by your words, because I think, like a lot of people, I also wrestle with this inside outside situation. And I've become, as you know, as I've gotten older, I've been more aware of this hustle that I've internalized, even though I'm not like a, you know, entrepreneur or anything, but like how much that particular story continues to impact me and impact my decisions. So even when I can sense a direction of health or of bounty or of connection with nature or connection with other people, I can feel the hustle kind of like going, hey man, where's my piece of the pie? And so just hearing your ability to work with that spirit, which in some sense is a very 60s vibe, but you implanted it and stuck with it in a way that has allowed you to have a genuinely different perspective on things. And I think for a lot of people, you know, maybe my generation, but definitely younger, the very terms you're talking about are almost hard to locate. Where is the outside of the broadcast, as you call it? Because it's not really a broadcast anymore, it's a multicast. And some of the channels on the multicast are very alternative, but it's hard to see the way that they're opposed or radically different than the broadcast, because it's all, you know, it's part of this immense weave. And those distinctions are still incredibly valid, but I think they're increasingly hard to see as we go into the digital generations. And your model here, I think, is really well, it's inspiring to me. So
well, that, you know, I'm learning a lot. Not only here right now, I'm certainly learning a lot from you, but recently on the other readings and so on. I'm really, really detached from the current young generation, that their reality, I wouldn't even presume to even begin to talk for them or about them. I would like to know, and you're saying stuff that kind of makes me a little sad, but maybe not. But I just want to make one comment here. I say the broadcast and you say multicast, but what I'm trying to say, the broadcast is a culture, and you can distinguish cultures, you know when you're in the hustle and when you're not. But what I hear you saying is that people don't know when they're in the hustle, when they're not. And I just don't know what to do with that. I mean, I just sit down and shut up at that point. If you don't know what the hustle is, wow, maybe it gets help. I mean, I just don't know. It's so obvious when you're hustling, you got commodities, that's why you're in the world. And then it's very obvious when people who are not that. It's so just totally obvious. So I kind of can't get it that you're telling me that en masse there are all these people who can't make that distinction. Wow, that's depressing.
I think it's more, I mean, yeah, there's a depressing aspect of it or a challenging aspect to it. But I think for me, what it comes down to is the positive role that these technologies of the self, the practices of expanded consciousness, that moving into visionary states and the immense perspective shifts that those provide, the way in which they do really have a role to play, because they are part of the way in which people remap their sense of identity, their sense of who's speaking for them, their degree of alienation. You know, they can help produce alienation, and alienation in our current environment can be a really good thing.
Oh,
difficult,
it's fantastic.
But it's
it's
really important.
Somebody said it's no achievement to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Exactly. So for me, this is actually, even though there's a sort of a challenging aspect to it, it also really underscores why these precise things that you were talking about are still important, because they're part of that journey, away from the broadcast. I know we've gotten far away from Belson here and we're towards the end, but I did want to, shift and focus again on a very specific story, and whether you can help tell us something. And I'd say that partly because I'm such a San Francisco history buff. And so I've always been fascinated with the Vortex concerts, which were held here at the planetarium in Golden Gate Park in the late 1950s. And one of the figures was Jordan Belson, the other one was Henry Jacobs. Right. And these were very revolutionary at the time. They made a lot. They were doing some really interesting stuff. But for all the accounts that I've read, I'm still not really sure what it was like or what they were doing or what was fresh about it. And so I know we've shifted the conversation to something very specific and historical, but that's what you get with a history buff. So,
oh no, I'm right with you. You know, I was never at one,
ah,
but I have two questions. Well, one observation and a question. I'm sure they were projecting certainly Jordan's films and Jacobs. I don't know. I forgot. I interviewed him, but I just forgot. But I'm sure they were projecting those films on that dome. So then the question is, has anything like that been done since? And is it not being done now? And if not, why the hell not? Those, as you know, those environments are holy. You know, you go in that thing and it's sacred. You're in, it's fantastic. I'd like to be there every day for a little while. And so that would be my question. And regarding San Francisco, let me just put in for 15 years, my wife Jane and I have been working on a book and video series about the video diaries of a guy named George Kuchar.
oh yeah.
He's from San Francisco. Every day, all day, we're in San Francisco. and we love it. And we've been there, of course, many times. I would be in San Francisco if it wasn't Santa Fe. Incredible place.
Yes.
So anyway, that you know, that's neither here nor there, but he gives me a lot of joy. So yeah, so anyway, well, what about that? Had there been, oh wait, that connects to Stan Vanderbeek and Expanded Cinema trying to build what he called movie dromes, which were today we might call the planetariums. And I've got an anecdote about him that I didn't tell here before. This will give you a little insight into who Stan was. I love the man. Passion, I love passion. So he was always looking for the ideal, what do you call a movie drone. And so at one point he was teaching in Florida, South Florida, went down to stay with him. And he said, I found it. I found the movie drone. So he takes us to the abandoned Hava Tampa cigar factory. This is 2 floors, 10,000 square feet, covered on, and it's abandoned. And on the bottom, on the floors are about 3 inches deep cigar wrappers. And the scent, the odor was so incredible. But this place was a tinderbox if there ever was one. He finds a newspaper, lights it on fire because it was dark, it was getting dark, and he starts waving the thing around so we could see this space that he's talking about. And we almost jumped on him. Stan, put that back. Just stuff that I remember about that. It's passion takes you to crazy places.
No, I wish David McConville was here, because part of his whole career is tracing the dome and that sacred space of the dome back through time, you know, and then into Vortex concerts and onto, you know, Pink Floyd light shows, and then new forms that he's worked on of how to bring a kind of cosmological or cosmic consciousness, how to deliver that or encourage that, inculcate that in people through new forms of dome light shows and educational platforms. So it's unfortunately minor, but it's also kind of happening. And one thing that's really happening now is that the technology of dome projections have really advanced radically, so that there are a number of places that are, you know, commercial establishments, but some of them are programmed by people who are 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And so some of it's actually really interesting programming that are really designed for that full immersion with a kind of cosmic or psychedelic dimension to it. And again, it's one of those, it's kind of a liminal space, because from the outside, it looks like just another sort of corporate entertainment thing. But then once you start to get into it and see what's happening to people and the motivations of some of the curators and programmers, you realize that this isn't really business as usual either. So I feel like that technology is still part of our realm of possibility. And I just wish David was here to talk about it, because he's the pro.
Yeah, he's a nice guy. I can only repeat this. If you tell yourself, let's say you're in those spaces that you just described, we're never outside of them, you know, you don't get outside of capitalism, even when you're not in it, I would think. But in any case, if you tell yourself I am using this. I am consciously using this as a technology of myself to change myself. And there you are rocking out in some, light show and, and commercials coming on. But you tell yourself, this is what I'm doing. And you keep telling yourself over and over and over again every day of your life. That matters. You can override the hustle in your head. And then that makes you pissed off. Hey, I've just overridden you in my head and you're not letting me out. Excuse me, where's the door? I've got a thing at the front of my introduction to expanded cinema from Confucius. The way out is via the door. Why is it no one uses this method? Hey, the door is open.
I think that might be a good place to wind up, because we've been about an hour and 15 here, and that's just a really beautiful summation of that attitude towards the way that technologies of the self are not just narcissistic, that they are expansive and political, that they involve media and altered states of consciousness, but they have a directionality to them that is both escape and a genuine alternative. And
they can be that if we say so.
Yeah, and I didn't think this conversation would go this way. I'm super happy it did.
Me too.
I really appreciate your life wisdom on this stuff, and I think a lot of people hearing it really appreciate it as well.
Well, I loved it, and time goes fast when you're really enjoying it.
Yeah. Any let's finally see if there's any last little questions here. That one's a little bit. Here's the allospheres reference as a kind of place for the sphere, and yeah, there's some nice stuff in the notes and chat, so check that out. And yeah, Barry, it's been really fun. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks. And here's Erik's book again. If anybody wants to hear more of his work, High Weirdness, fantastic. And next week we are going to be back with Tina Rivers Ryan, who's a curator, historian, and educator specializing in art since the 1960s. And her work focuses on new media technologies. And I think the section is on the television or on TV. So thanks, everybody, and see you next week. Thanks, Gene.
Thanks for putting this together, Barry. Bye,
Yeah.
everybody.
Bye. Great to meet you, Gene.
Likewise.